Good afternoon. So today the idea is just to present some of the results of the report, or the highlights of the report on the elections, the super election cycle. So 2023 and 2025 was the super electoral cycle in which half of the citizens in the democracies elected their local, national, and international representatives. And then it was a very important test for humanity and for our democracies. So the right to freedom of assembly and association play an essential role for the effective exercise of the right to participate in political and public life, including the realization of the right to vote and elect and be elected in genuine elections, and to push back against the global democratic backsliding that we are living worldwide. Associations such as civil society and political parties are fundamental in elections. And then, although the role of political parties is more clear, some governments, especially the more repressive and coercive environments, do not recognize that the participation of civil society is also vital for the elections. So civil society promote electoral integrity, human rights, and inclusive political participation. Also, civil society advocate for legal reforms, support marginalized groups, educate voters, prevent electoral violence, monitor elections to enhance transparency and public trust, also contrast misinformation, promote peaceful engagement, and expose fraud, among many other important tasks. But despite these essential activities, they were stigmatized, suppressed, and criminalized by the use of smear campaign and disinformation, weaponization of foreign agent laws, anti-terrorism, and extremist measures, and also civil society faced harassment, arbitrary detention, torture, and even killings. In a similar way, opposition parties and candidates face political persecution, arbitrary restriction, and legal obstacles, including registration requirements that were burdensome, and state control over internal procedures. And then opposition parties also face financial barriers such as high registration fees and restricted funding. The political repression in this super election cycle from 2023 to 2025, the first quarter, escalated globally, the political repression, with opposition figures subjected to arbitrary detention, prosecution, and attacks, and where the judicial systems were also used to silence dissent, and candidates were attacked by both state and non-state actors. In the same way, the right to peaceful assembly, including protests, although there is essential for electoral participation, which has been proven historically, and the cycle also saw an increase in global protests that were manifesting dissatisfaction with the election process, alleged fraud, repression, exclusion, and other societal issues. But in response, many governments restricted the right to assemble through also administrative restrictions, arbitrary arrests, excessive force, stigmatization, and criminalization of protesters. And in extreme cases, we saw mass detentions and the use of deadly force. And these actions will reflect a broader trend of silencing dissent and stifle public dialogue. And also, another of the conclusion of the report was the problematic use of digital technologies. So many states use biometric voter registration without transparency, oversight, and legal safeguards, deepening the distrust on these systems. And then surveillance technology like facial recognition and spyware were also used against activists, opposition leaders, and enabling discriminatory mass surveillance and political repression. And then all these discouraged participation, suppressed turnout, and enabled post-election reprisals, creating chilling effect, especially on marginalized groups, by instilling fear and undermining public identity. And following the super electoral cycle, freedom of peaceful assembly and association is still facing increasing threats, with new governments curbing civic activism through funding restriction and criminalization and stigmatization. And then the rhetoric around, for example, the funding and vilification of USAID also created even more stigmatization, revived foreign agent laws, and justified crackdowns in many different countries in different regions. The cycle underscored that democracy extends beyond the election day, and then ensuring freedom of assembly and association through the cycle to the electoral cycle and in electoral moments is essential for genuine elections. Civic society and media must be respected and post-election expressions protected to keep authorities accountable. And without space for peaceful engagement, elections cannot be considered free, fair, or genuine. So it's a relation between the respect of freedom of assembly and of association and the actual existence of free and fair elections. The report includes a list of recommendations that I can mention later. But then the most obvious recommendation, and perhaps not so obvious if I need to say it, is that authorities must understand that being in a public position means that they need to be open to receiving and considering criticism from the public, the media, the civic society, and other organizations, and from protest. So dissent is part of democratic societies, and rather than being repressed, as it is being now, should be welcome and permanently protected. So the report is also a window of opportunity and needs to become also a guide for the next elections, because we are having elections all the time, and then how all those recommendations can actually meet the possibility for governments to do reform and to actually take more into account the need of the respect of freedom of assembly and of association. That is from my side.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Romero. The next speaker will be Ms. Irene Khan, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on the freedom of opinion and expression.
Thank you. Let me start by saying that last year we saw countries populated with about a total of half of the world's population going to the polls, as you heard, from liberal democracies like the European Union to electoral autocracies like Russia. Both the right to freedom of expression and the right to vote are endangered. We saw enough over the past year to make that statement. And from my perspective, the perspective of my mandate on freedom of expression, I would say that there are three key trends that come together to create a perfect storm, endangering our right to freedom of expression and our right to vote. And these three trends, first, rising authoritarian trends, and polarized politics in backsliding democracies. The second are social media platforms awash with hate speech and disinformation. And the third factor is a media sector that is too weak to debunk the lies. Authoritarian governments determined to hold on to power and populist politicians eager to win elections at all costs are manipulating information to destroy their political opponents, restrict voter participation, disrupt the electoral process, and delegitimize election results. And what are some common practices that we have seen in recent elections? Vilification of minorities, smear campaigns against women politicians, attacks on journalists and human rights defenders, threats to electoral officials, observers, and judges. Public officials and politicians bear significant responsibility for polluting the information environment in this way. They are turning their right to speech into a weapon to attack vulnerable groups. Advocacy of hatred to incite violence is increasingly evident on campaign trails and social media platforms. It is actually prohibited under international law, even when it masquerades as political speech. Secondly, while information manipulation has long existed in electoral politics, digital technology and social media platforms have taken that threat to a new level, enabling and amplifying disinformation and hate speech as never before. For instance, in several recent elections, divisive, incendiary, and hateful statements from political leaders went viral, instigating deadly violence against vulnerable minorities, chilling free expression, and impeding voter participation. At a time of rising hate and lies, I am alarmed to see large social media platforms and search engines backsliding on their commitments to electoral integrity, safety, transparency, and risk management. The largest platforms have radically scaled down staff and resources and rolled back key policies with no apparent human rights due diligence. And although economic considerations and the rise of generative AI have played a part in their decision, there is no doubt that so have political and ideological considerations. And I fear that there will be more backsliding by platforms given the policy position taken by the US administration on freedom of expression. Let me now come to the third factor that I talked about, the decline of independent, free, pluralistic media. Journalists covering elections have been violently attacked. Public officials in many countries have sought to discredit independent media as liars, traitors, foreign agents. In some countries, independent media no longer exists because of total state control. In some others, the media has been captured by actors aligned with the state or other powerful interests. And the concentration of media ownership in some of the largest, longest liberal democracies in the world have led to heavily partisan coverage that undercuts public trust in credible journalism and encourages divisive political debate. And as readers and audiences shift to digital platforms, the financial problems of the media outlets make them more vulnerable to closure or capture. Then let me now turn to the role of states. Some states have adopted good electoral practices based on human rights, but many others have disrupted the internet, blocked websites, sponsored disinformation, attacked independent media, fact-checkers, criminalized legitimate political expression, all under the guise of fighting disinformation. And in many countries, electoral bodies are unable to play their information-related roles because they lack capacity, expertise, resources, but most of all, because they lack institutional independence and are under undue political influence. My report makes many recommendations. I will not go into all that, but let me just mention that undermining freedom of expression in the name of fighting disinformation is short-sighted. Freedom of expression is vital to healthy democratic discourse. It is possible to restrict disinformation or any form of information under international law, but it must follow, the restriction must follow the principles of legality, necessity, proportionality, and legitimate objectives. The other point is the backsliding of social media platforms. That should ring an alarm bell that states and international community ignore at their peril. There needs to be smart social media regulation, not to control content, but to encourage companies to comply with their human rights obligations. And the companies themselves must live up to their obligations under the UN guiding principles. Democracy needs a healthy legacy media as well, alongside trustworthy online environment. And the decline of media freedom must be addressed urgently by states. And finally, experience shows that we need to have approaches that are multifaceted, multi-stakeholder, all of us around the table with civil society, governments, companies, to sit down to fight these problems. So thank you.
Thank you to the Special Rapporteur. The experts will now take questions. If there are any questions for either rapporteur, please raise your hand and state your name and organization. Imen?
Yes, thank you so much. I'm Iman Khreji from the Kuwait News Agency. I have actually a question on the report of the Special Rapporteur of Freedom of Expression. It's not related to the report, but my question is actually if you have noticed a further decline in freedom of opinion and expression, particularly in the Western country or even globally, following the war in Gaza specifically. And if you could give also some finding regarding the war in Gaza and the targeting of journalists there as part of the effort of the Israeli military there to obscure what is happening there. So if you could elaborate or answer to this question. I know it's not in the report, or I presume it's not in the report, but thank you so much.
Sorry, could you repeat your second question on Israel? I did not hear that clearly.
Yeah, actually, if you have some funding about the targeting of journalists in Gaza, especially as part if the Israeli effort, let's say, to obscure the what is happening there. So if you have some data or
Yes.
or information on that.
Okay. Let me start with your second question first about Gaza and targeting of journalists. As you know, in Gaza, we've seen the highest number of journalists killed in any conflict in recent times. And among those killings, there has been clear evidence that a number of them have at least based on the information that is available to us, because remember, we don't have full access to that place. In fact, international media has not been even allowed into the area. There have been cases where there was targeting, particularly of Al Jazeera journalists in a number of cases, but also other freelance journalists, and also not just journalists, targeted journalists and killing of journalists, but in addition to that, targeted attacks on media equipment. Under international law, both journalists and their equipment are civilian and therefore protected and should not be targeted. So clearly, there is that is an allegation of a war crime that needs to be investigated. And I hope that the international community will be very active on it and that the International Criminal Court will look at these issues. In relation to the decline of freedom of expression, I think it's a global decline. Indeed, in every region of the world, we see pushback against freedom of expression. We see pressure on journalists. It happens in different forms. Whereas in some countries, you may see journalists being killed. In some countries, you see outlets being shut down. But in other countries, and particularly in Western countries, what we have seen is closure of media outlets. There are parts of the United States where there are what's called media deserts, because small radio stations, small outlets, community-based newspapers are disappearing. Now, at first sight, you might say, well, that's economic reality. But if you dig deeper in that, you will actually find a capture of media by large media companies. And that is reducing media pluralism and media diversity. There is a chilling, when leading government officials go out and talk about media being the enemy of the people, or media being fake, or journalists being liars, that creates a hostile environment in which other people become emboldened to attack journalists. And that is happening across the board, as I said, whether it's Western liberal democracies or electoral autocracies. There is a lot of pressure on independent media.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Imena, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, please. Yeah, about the second question, actually, about the decline of freedom of expression. It was actually related. My question, it was if you noticed that the decline is it has increased after the war in Gaza. Is there any relationship on that? Yeah.
Yes. Let me say that what I have seen, in fact, if you look at my report, which I presented to the UN General Assembly in October, in which I examined the impact on freedom of expression of the Gaza conflict around the world, and there clearly there has been a suppression, active efforts sometimes to suppress expression, protests, slogans, even symbols. There has been clearly active action taken by authorities to stop that in many Western countries, Canada, the United States, Germany, other parts of Europe as well, where you're not allowed to say certain slogans. From the river to the sea has become a slogan of terrorism rather than an expression of Palestinian aspiration for freedom. We have seen a scarf become a symbol of terrorism and support when it's actually a show of solidarity for a people under attack. So simple things like that, even going out to protest. If you have a huge amount of police surrounding half a dozen or a dozen protesters, that's a sign of intimidation, and that stops people from shouting slogans. I have been myself on the outskirts of one demonstration in Berlin where people were being told by the police that you can go in there, but there are certain slogans you cannot use. Now, Germany has freedom of expression. In Germany, you cannot simply rule out certain things. Sure, if I say something that is hate speech, the police can come in and arrest me, and there will be a court case. But you cannot tell someone you cannot say that beforehand, prior censorship. And that is happening everywhere. That is happening, and in many cases, authorities are doing nothing, no action against those who are making those threats to others. And what we then see is it's not just Palestinians. Then it happens to climate activists. And then slowly it creeps. That is the real danger. The downward slide of censorship is the first sign of an authoritarian trend. And I think liberal democracies should wake up to that danger now.
I don't know if I can do also.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, and the same it's happening with the right of freedom of assembly and association. Irene already mentioned what is happening with the protests, and then we have seen that as a trend also in many different settings, many different type of governments, many different countries, and many different regions. And then also is it's very clear the double standards that the different institutions have been applied, not only the law enforcement agencies, but also certain political discourse that actually stigmatize and criminalize certain type of assemblies and certain type of protest and not others. And this is something that is also putting a lot of pressure on the guarantee of the right of freedom of assembly and the right to protest in even the so-called more stable democracies, including Germany, as Irene was saying, but also I've been following cases with students, for example, that were participating in pro-Palestine protests in the UK, in France, in the Netherlands, also in the US, and the US is having a very big backslide also with protests. But then last year I started also with the curtailing of the right of freedom of assembly and protest on the pro-Palestine movement. And then I want to also mention the differential impact on certain groups. So in all these countries and others, we see that are the Arab population, the migrants, the Afro-descendant, black people, and even the Latinos, who are actually more repressed and more curtailed in the right to participate in the pro-Palestine movement than any other type of actors. I have even cases in which monitors of elections that were, for example, like white, were actually allowed to do the monitoring. Well, if you see that there were like a black or a Latino monitor of election in the U.S., they were actually removed from the protest instead of having them allowed to just to do their work. And this is actually eroding also the capacity for governments and law enforcement officials to fulfill the obligation to facilitate freedom of assembly and the right to protest.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for the Special Rapporteur? For the Special Rapporteurs? Anything? Doesn't seem to be that there are other questions. Would either of you like to add anything? Because we have a little time, or would you like to close?
I would just like to add that as journalists, I know you don't like to be in the news, but I think this is a time when unfortunately you are being put in the news because of the pressure that is coming. And this pressure, all you have to do is to look at the legislation, the online safety bills, the policing acts in many countries around the world. And what happens in the one region, particularly in the West, is usually copied in others. So this is what makes this issue so dangerous globally, and I hope that journalists will continue to pay close attention to what is happening, because you are going to be directly affected.
Sorry, we have a question in the room. Yes, please.
Yes, I have to. I'm sorry I came late because today there are so many meetings on freedom of expression that the only worthwhile one, or one of the two worthwhile one, I missed. I discovered just 5 minutes ago. I have 2 or 3 questions. First, it may be a little bit beside the point, but in Europe and America, the issue about wokeism is becoming a central issue in any kind of intellectual life. In Geneva, at the university, they want to purge the library of any bad thoughts so that citizens could only think good. This is not a joke. It is a central issue. I like to know if you think this is totally outside the point, beside the point of freedom of expression, because those criticizing the woke way have their mouth shut, sometimes in a very, very harsh way. This is sorry for my clumsy English, but you see what I am referring to. Second thing, lately I was addressed by one of the UN press officers very kindly. I hope that this time you will behave, etc. If this is the example, if the UN gives this example of independence of journalists, what do you think of that? And third, Madame Khan, I know you from the time you were a lawyer at High Commission for Refugees. I have greatest regard and respect for you. But when there was this issue of uprising in Canton de Vaud, you made a report, and the public, le ministère public, Éric Cottier, sent a 10-letter page showing or claiming that there were mistakes. I never heard that this report was being corrected. I wrote, there was at Mormont, l'affaire du Mormont près de Lausanne. I think you made a report, and I wrote to you to know what you thought of the, let's say, the critics of the Ministère Public de l'État de Vaud. As far as I remember, you were in charge of that report. In any case, sorry, I can't.
So I want to be, fair to you. Which year are you talking about? Recently?
It was 3, 4, 5 years back.
5 years ago, I wasn't even the Special Rapporteur, so it couldn't have been me.
I don't know. It was a question. I don't want to attack you.
No. But if you are picking up something specific, then I have a right to ask you to be specific. Okay. And I would suggest, send an email. My colleagues are here. You can get their card, and we do that.
I mailed
to
at
raise
the
it
time.
in a press conference in this way, you have to be prepared as well.
I mailed at the time. I never got a reply. But okay, that doesn't change basically the issue. So about the woke issue, which I consider.
On the woke issue, I'm very happy to take that, because I have considered it. I think it doesn't matter whether it is woke or whether it is conservative point of view or whatever point of view. Freedom of expression as a right is very clearly stated that ideas and images and information of any kind in any media, we can search, we can find, we can read, we can share, we can use any media to communicate with others. So freedom of expression is a very broad right. And whether it is wokeism or whether it's conservatism, it does not matter. It can be restricted, but under certain very limited circumstances. And the effort of any society at any time to create a single narrative whether it is a woke society or whether it is a conservative society. When you try to create a single narrative, we know where you're going. We are going towards authoritarianism. And that is something that is incompatible with freedom of expression. In fact, freedom of expression, the purpose of it is actually to create or give people access to diverse sources of information and to be able to create diverse sources, whether it's art, whether it's politics, whether it's media, in whatever field. So trying to have just a single point of view, censorship, taking out books from libraries, or telling academics they cannot teach certain subjects, or telling us what clothes we should wear. That happens to women as well, for example, and that is also part of freedom of expression. So it's a very broad right, and I think efforts of that kind are extremely dangerous because they are trying to destroy our human rights, and these are rights. Freedom of expression, for example, is a right that promotes human dignity. So it is undignified for people too.
Thank you. I'm going to quote you 1 million times.
Thank you.
Thank you. If there are no further questions, I think we will now close this press conference. I'd just like to thank both the Special Rapporteurs for being here with us today, and thank you for joining us at this briefing.